Today I am joined by the man, the legend, a Raw Egg Nationalist. He is an author, an anonymous bodybuilding icon, and in the words of Tucker Carlson, if the bro scientists have a spiritual leader, it would be the man who calls himself Raw Egg Nationalist. Welcome.
Thanks ever so much for having me, Alice.
Thank you so much for coming on. This has been an episode that I've been planning. I kind of wanted to speak with you for a while, and then at one point you followed me, and I was like, "Yes, excellent! Now we can we can get things going." You are, as my intro implied, somewhat of essentially an icon because you represent almost the physical being of you exudes this aura of wisdom about nutrition, about fitness, and about nationalism. So, tell me a little bit about slonking. I mean, this is kind of this is what it's called, the consumption of raw eggs. And why is this such a symbolic gesture?
Well, I think it's symbolic on a number of levels. It's an essential part of uh, raw egg nationalism because the egg represents, in many ways, the opposite of the kind of disgusting food that we're offered today by global corporations, by these huge companies that control ever increasing proportions of the food market in the US and around the globe. The egg is a local food. It's nutrient dense. It's highly nutritious. It's natural. You can get it right from the source. You can keep chickens in your own garden, or you can go to your local farm if you live in the countryside and pick up some eggs. There's very little mediation between a consumer of eggs and the eggs that they eat. Ideally, so I mean, we sort of fixed on the raw eggs, I think, for that reason, but also because they are an incredible superfood. They're a much maligned food. In fact, I don't think that there are many other foods that have been quite so maligned as eggs, because eggs contain significant quantities of cholesterol and fat. Then they've been, for 50 plus years, really, then we've been told not to eat eggs, when in fact, actually what we should be doing is eating as many as possible. One of the things that I talked about recently in an article that I wrote for the American Mind, which was about Just Egg, which is this vegan plant-based egg alternative, which is just like something Satan himself, might have come up with. In 1968, when Lyndon B. Johnson was president, then he was in a similar position to Joe Biden today. He was suffering a series of crises, that the Vietnam War, inflation crisis, and he was told by one of his advisors that people were getting ordinary people in the US were getting very, very annoyed about the fact that the price of eggs kept rising. And so what did Lyndon B. Johnson do? Well, being Lyndon B. Johnson, he told the Surgeon General to issue a warning about the cholesterol content of eggs. And so that really began this sort of 50-year process of demonizing what is actually one of nature's most perfect superfoods. So I wrote about that. Not a lot of people know about that, but that is actually the primary reason why eggs in particular in the US have been singled out as something that people with heart conditions, people who have high cholesterol, shouldn't eat. When in actual fact, in recent decades, then the science is pointing completely the opposite direction now, that actually consumption of cholesterol is good for you, that consumption of cholesterol doesn't raise your blood cholesterol levels unless you've got some kind of quite rare condition. So really what we're doing is we're pushing against the corporate regime that is trying to sell you, processed foods and foods that are as far away from the kind of foods that our ancestors used to thrive on. And then we've just embraced eggs because, yes, they are a superfood. Once upon a time, they were integral to golden age bodybuilding diets. Vince Gironda, who is my avatar, he was a golden age bodybuilding guru, and he was a great champion of eggs and the consumption of massive quantities of eggs rather than anabolic steroids. So it's I mean, that explains the health aspects and the nationalism aspects really too.
Yeah, so it's an kind of an aesthetic movement and historically informed by kind of this bodybuilding culture. And I mean, it looks good as well. Like kind of that, what would it be like 70s era bodybuilding? There's quite a lot of inspirational images from that period, and I can imagine that kind of flows into the personas that we see on anonymous Twitter.
Yeah, well, I'd say it's like 50s to 70s and maybe 60s is the kind of late 60s sort of is probably the real kind of flowering of the golden age. When you've got people like, well, Vince Gironda, but also people like Arnold Schwarzenegger just starting to emerge, just really before the physiques became grotesque. That's the thing, the golden age bodybuilders still wanted to achieve the sort of timeless aesthetic principles that the Greeks had laid down. And in fact, that's actually something that Vince Gironda himself says in his book, which is called The Wild Physique. He talks about the timeless principles of aesthetics that were established by the Greeks 2,000 years ago and that inform his entire philosophy of bodybuilding. So he was very different from bodybuilders today who would be interested really only in putting on as much mass as possible. If you compare a bodybuilder from the 1950s or 60s to a modern bodybuilder, I mean, it's an incredible change that has taken place. And really, what they've done is they've abandoned any sort of any kind of sense of proportion, symmetry, balance. That kind of stuff's all gone out the window, and it's just mass for mass's sake, really.
Yeah, they tend to look like those genetically modified, I don't know, cows that they have for beef. I think like Charolais or something, just like some yeah, genetic aberrations. Yeah, it's interesting because as a woman, looking at those pictures from the 60s and 70s, I can kind of understand the aesthetics. I mean, those guys were big. If you'd probably poll all women, they'd probably prefer a smaller physique, even so. But the guys that are now, I don't know, Mr. Olympia or something like that, they look like abominations from the pits of
Yeah.
hell. Like there's just something wrong with that, and it's kind of like just viscerally repulsive.
It's
But yeah,
body dysmorphia, really. There's no doubt about it. It is a form of body dysmorphia.
yeah, male
Um,
to male transgender. Or what was it?
yeah, that was very good. That was Darren Beattie, wasn't it? In
Yeah.
his piece about Black Rifle Coffee. Yeah, that was a very good thing he came up with.
Yeah, it's interesting. Kind of going back to the egg thing, like how deep the propaganda about it goes. Like even here in Romania, like I tend to feed my I have a son who's like a year and a little bit old, and I tend to feed him a lot of eggs and a lot of butter. Like I spoon feed him Kerrygold. I know a lot of people will judge me for this, but he loves it. And like I think like a few days ago, I just like in passing told a lady that helps me out, like watching him for a few hours while I work. And I told her, "Oh, he's had 4 eggs today. He's been really he's been eating." And she was like, "Oh my God, you're giving your baby heart disease." And I'm like, they don't get heart disease that early. Number one, and two, he's fine. He loves it. Like it's absolutely fine for that. But it's incredible. I mean, this lady, she's in her 50s. She's Romanian. She's not on any sort of connected to the internet, but it's she's been thoroughly incepted with this information that you shouldn't be having salt, you shouldn't be having eggs, you shouldn't be having butter, you should have sunflower oil. Everyone cooks in sunflower oil here. That's the main thing. And if you ask someone like, what's the price of oil, it's specifically refined sunflower oil. That's what people cook in. That's what you fry in. That's what you put in soups and stuff. It's quite sad. So she's really concerned about me, but I'm fine. But it's crazy how how deep the story goes, and even people who you'd think like are kind of more trad minded here, they yeah, it's been a while since this information got out.
Yeah, well, listen, we've been bombarded with this kind of information for decades and decades. I mean, it's not only that we've been, well, I mean, we've undergone a fundamental transformation in the way that we live and eat in the last 100 or so years. And this is something that I talk about in my new book, The Eggs Benedict Option, why we're eating this way. Well, it's a complicated story. And it does have to do with industrialization, with urbanization. It's not, you can't simply say that it's some kind of conspiracy or plan by big corporations to make us ill, by feeding us substandard food, although it does look like that to some extent. And it certainly is the case that, corporations and the medical establishment are the chief beneficiaries of these significant changes, of these transformations that have happened in the way that we live and eat. And they continue to benefit from our ill health and encourage it really with faulty science and with a kind of medical focus that's on ad hoc treatment rather than addressing the underlying causes of people's illness, whether mental or physical. But yes, we've in the last 100 years we really have moved fundamentally away from the kind of foods that we should be eating, the kind of foods that our ancestors ate, that sustained them and allowed them to flourish. One of the key books, I think, that anybody who wants to understand this process and its implications is Weston Price, Nutrition and Physical Degeneration, which I talk about heavily in the Eggs Benedict Option because it's an amazing book. So Weston Price was a dentist. He was Canadian, but he had his practice in Cleveland, Ohio I think he qualified as a dentist in something like 1890 or 1889. Anyway, he had this dental practice in Cleveland at the turn of the 20th century, just as Americans were beginning to undergo this diet transformation. So a transformation from what we might call ancestral type foods to the products of industrial food production, refined grains, different kinds of vegetable oils, that kind of thing, but especially refined grains and refined grain products. So he noticed in his dental practice that more and more of his patients, but especially children, would turn up with worse and worse dental health. So he was seeing more and more children with terrible cavities, with malformed jaws, narrow cheeks, narrow nasal passages, recessed jaws. What you have to understand is that dentition, the overall health of the face and the mouth, is actually an index of broader health. So, if you are displaying these kinds of symptoms, physical effects in your face and mouth, then actually your whole body is going to be unwell too. So Weston Price noticed these changes taking place, and he started to form a hypothesis about what might be causing it. And being a sensible man, he thought it's probably what people are eating now. So he went on this globe-trotting trek, basically across every continent apart from Antarctica, in search of traditional societies who were still eating their traditional foods, in order to try and find groups that displayed perfect health. So dentition, he was looking at their faces, at their facial development and their teeth and jaws, but also overall their resistance to disease, their physical, their stature, all that kind of stuff. And he found I think 15 or 16 different groups, different tribes, traditional societies, people like the Inuit, the Maasai. He found some people in the Outer Hebrides in Scotland, some traditional crofters, living on the islands who were eating their traditional diets. People up in the high alpine areas of Switzerland, dairy farmers. People in the Torres Straits Islands, off the coast of Australia, northern coast of Australia. And what he basically discovered was that all of these groups, despite the geographical differences, despite the cultural differences, were all prioritizing one particular kind of food. And that was what you might call nutrient-dense animal products. So these are things like especially organ meat, liver, especially fatty cuts of meat, So not the lean cuts of meat that we might prize, like the tenderloin or fillet, but the fattier cuts of meat. Things like eggs, blood products, or just blood, plain and simple, milk and cheese. What else? And fat products as well, things like butter, lard, that kind of stuff. And seafood. Seafood was the other thing. So, uh, those are the kinds of foods that people in their traditional settings will prioritize if they can. And if they can eat them, then they will display fantastic health. And those are precisely the kind of foods now that we're moving further and further away from in our diets in the developed world and elsewhere. There's no, even in Weston Price's time, then he found among these traditional societies groups of people who were starting to eat Western style industrial grain diets, and they were starting to display all the symptoms that Weston Price noticed back at his practice in Ohio. So, yeah, we're moving away from a template of nutrition, of dietary health that was laid down, well, probably when humans first, became human. And there are studies. There was a recent Israeli study, for instance, that suggested that our more distant ancestors, so not other forms of hominid, so not Homo sapiens, but other forms of hominid, were super carnivores, which basically means that they ate nothing but meat. And the authors of this study reckon that maybe for 2 million years, our ancestors ate nothing but meat, basically. So I think that the value of a book like Weston Price's Nutrition and Physical Degeneration is that it basically lays out some iron rules, what I would call iron rules for nutrition, and it's very hard to dispute his findings. And I think that we can lay so many of our present ills at the feet of this dietary transformation that has taken place within the last 100 years.
Yes, I have to say, I just in terms of my experience with these diets, I have to say I agree. I mean, I've been probably my leanest and healthiest, and by that I mean just my waist circumference. I feel like that's been the best kind of indicator of my overall health that I've ever had. Has been lowest, almost like to the sense that I've changed body types when I was doing the ketogenic diet, but mostly
Mm.
meat. And then I did carnivore for a few months, and that was really excellent. But just I was working in the city of London, and I was working in sales, and I had to go out with clients, and there was steak juices seeping into my serviette to like it was a very kind of logistically troubling situation. So I had to quit it after a while. But yeah, almost impossible to compare just the way that I felt. It wasn't very for endurance sports because I ran like a race at that point. It was really bad. It was a very hard race, but maybe I wasn't adapted to that diet yet. But it was in terms of anything else, from gut health to just sleep to how I felt during the day, it was just incomparable to any other existence, I would say.
Well, I mean, one of the things that I say to people in general is just look, if you feel rotten, if you feel really awful, try changing your diet, try a radical change, because you can always go back. This is the thing, and this is it. It always surprises me actually that people aren't more willing just to try 6 weeks of a totally different diet, because actually within 6 weeks, I can assure you, if you change your diet in the right way, you will feel like a different person. I mean, if you think you're sensitive to gluten, and a lot of people are, and gluten sensitivity actually is rising around the world for various reasons, not least of all because wheat is very heavily treated with chemicals, including glyphosate, which is an absolute nightmare. But also because modern varieties of wheat have been engineered so that they've been engineered with the consequence that actually they produce a more indigestible form of gluten in greater quantity than older varieties of wheat. So it's not a surprise that more and more people are actually becoming gluten intolerant or showing signs of gluten intolerance. But just if you think you're gluten intolerant, stop eating bread, stop eating gluten, and see how you feel. I would bet you would feel a lot better. I mean, I gave up bread, and I've never felt better. It was an amazing. It was a revelation, really, actually, when I gave up bread. Just the mental clarity and the lack of any kind of sort of digestive problems, any kind of sort of bad feelings in my stomach. All of that was just gone, and that was one food stuff. But yes, my advice is always to people: look, experiment on yourself. There's no reason not to, and there's potentially a huge amount to gain.
Yeah. What would be, let's say, maybe the top three interventions that you think most people today would benefit from? Like top three experiments that one might try.
Mm. Okay. Well, yeah, I would say firstly, give up gluten. Give up gluten. There's all sorts of evidence actually for the really quite harmful effects of gluten, not only physically but also mentally. So there's a paper that's become quite notorious because it's at the back of Mike Marr's book, Harassment Architecture. It's called Bread and Other Edible Agents of Mental Disease, which is quite the title for a paper. But it's about the evidence for links between various sort of mental disorders, schizophrenia, all that kind of stuff, and gluten consumption. And it's historical. There's all sorts of historical evidence. There's evidence from the Great Famine of, I think, 1934 or 1943 or 1944 in Holland, for instance, when there was a bread shortage, massive bread shortage, and rates of mental illness decreased dramatically. All sorts of evidence like that to substantiate the links actually between quite serious mental illness and gluten consumption. So I would say intervention one: eliminate gluten, and also, but be aware that gluten is used in a lot of products. You'll find gluten in places you would never expect to find it, and it can actually trigger reactions, even if the gluten is present in something like shampoo. Gluten is used in cosmetics as a thickener, and it can trigger reactions. So be careful. Try to read the labels. Try to find out what's in the products you're eating, and so pay attention. Number two, I would say, is cutting out vegetable and seed oils, and this has been a big thing on Twitter, on right-wing Twitter, and it's spreading over now into the sort of normie consciousness, into the mainstream, I think. But vegetable and seed oils are very bad, although they are promoted as being healthy fats. In fact, quite the opposite is true, and there's a very long history behind why animal fats came to be demonized and vegetable and seed oils came to be held up as healthy alternatives. That is very, very interesting, but I won't go into too much detail here. But anyway, vegetable and seed oils are in everything. They are a mainstay of all processed food. So if I say to you, cut out vegetable and seed oils, what I also mean is cut out all forms of processed food, because processed food is very bad indeed. It also contains lots of sugar, colorings, additives, sweeteners, all sorts of disgusting stuff. What you really want to be doing is you want to be preparing your own food as much as possible and preparing it from whole food sources. The third intervention, actually, I wouldn't call this. This is a dietary intervention, but it's more of a technical intervention. Learn how to cook. That's absolutely key as far as I'm concerned. Learn how to cook. It's not that hard. Learn how to use a saucepan, a frying pan. Learn how to control the heat in the frying pan. Get some good cookware. I use copper cookware, and because copper is such a good conductor of heat, it's actually quite possible to cook a steak in butter without burning the butter. But that will be another transformative thing. I think if you can learn how to cook, you can you're much more in control of what goes in your body, because you don't need to rely on other people's cooking in order to get your nutrition.
Yeah, that's a really good note, because I do have copper cookware as well, but I have to admit I keep it on the wall as decoration at the moment, so it's not being used. I use nonstick pans. I don't exactly know what they're coated with, but I'm sure it's some ghastly abomination. Should I take these things off the wall and learn how to cook with them?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the non-stick coatings aren't particularly nice. I mean, I don't think it's such a problem when the saucepan is new, but once it starts to get scuffed, you'll get microscopic bits of the coating in the food. So yeah, I would counsel you to use those very attractive copper saucepans. I mean, I was lucky enough to inherit a big load of old sort of French copper cookware, and it's just one of the best things about copper cookware is just that it conducts heat so well. It disperses the heat very, very nicely over the surface of the pan. That's why, for instance, copper cookware is very good for making custard, for boiling milk, because you don't get hot spots where the milk will start to curdle, which is something that you get with other forms of cookware. So yes, I would say bin
Okay.
the non-stick stuff.
Yeah, I will. It was kind of one of those things that just felt so practical that I didn't even want to research it too much lest I get too scared of my saucepans. But yeah, I should. I should. That's, it's been on the back burner, but I'll prioritize it. So that's really useful. Um with the eggs, is there a very, very specific reason why they should be consumed raw? Do they lose a lot of their potency or nutritional value if you cook them? I eat lots of eggs, but they're all cooked.
Well, I mean, first of all, the thing that I would say is that I would never discourage anybody from eating cooked eggs. If they don't want to eat raw eggs, fine, eat cooked eggs. I mean, I would say eat a soft boiled egg rather than don't nuke it, don't hard boil it. Make a nice omelette, scrambled eggs, soft boiled eggs. That's great. That's great. Absolutely great. You will still get the best quality nutrition. The thing about the raw eggs is that yes, you do lose some nutrition, some micronutrients, enzymes, things like that. B vitamins are damaged a little bit when you cook, and also the cholesterol, I think, is also slightly altered, might be oxidized. But overall, the main reason for consuming them raw is quantity. So if you've seen Cool Hand Luke, the Paul Newman film, you'll know that eating 50 boiled eggs is a very, very difficult thing to do. But actually, you could eat 50 raw eggs in 30 seconds. You could slonk 50 raw eggs in 30 seconds, and you probably wouldn't even feel full. Actually, that's the other thing. That's one thing that so many people say to me when they start slonking is actually, oh, I just knocked back 12 eggs, and it feels like, it doesn't it doesn't feel like 12 boiled eggs would. It feels great. It doesn't feel heavy on my stomach. Doesn't feel sort of problematic in any way at all. So yeah, so it's I mean, there's science behind it. So there's one of the things that Vince Gironda, the Golden Age bodybuilding guru, intuited or understood was that actually it's the cholesterol in eggs that is anabolic. I mean, there's protein, there's fantastic protein, the highest quality protein in eggs. Eggs get a score of 100 on the protein digestibility corrected amino acid score. They are a perfect protein, but no, it's the cholesterol. It's the cholesterol that is anabolic, and there have been studies recently, quite a few studies actually, that have substantiated what Gironda intuited, that there is the more cholesterol you eat, basically the more muscle you put on, and this has been demonstrated in a number of studies, and the effect is greater than for protein. So people tend to think, oh, you eat more protein, you put on more muscle. And that is true, but actually there's a stronger correlation between cholesterol consumption and muscle gain than there is between protein consumption and muscle gain. So it's about consuming huge quantities of cholesterol, really. That's what it is primarily.
And is there, like, for me, because I am little baby with this, I'm just imagining slonking 12 eggs, my skin's crawling. There's some way, for the non-initiate to sweeten the deal. Can I make like a custard or something out of it, or some intermediate form before I go all out on the slonking?
Absolutely. So you don't have to slonk eggs as they come. You really don't have to do that. So although a lot of people do. So there is a variation of slonking where you slonk what I call the OG shake, the original Gironda shake. So this would be raw eggs, a mixture of milk and heavy cream in equal proportion. So Vince Gironda called that half and half. So 250 milliliters or 100 milliliters of milk, 100 milliliters of cream. And then you add maybe some honey or some maple syrup to taste. And that is basically custard. I call that anabolic custard. And you can whisk it up with a spoon if you want, or leave the yolks whole. But you will have absolutely no problem knocking that back. It's more calorific, of course, because you've got milk and eggs. And ideally, the milk should be raw milk. But if you can't get raw milk, just get the best quality milk you can get. But yeah, that is absolutely, nobody could find that disgusting.
Absolutely. And then you just blend that up. And this would be like a meal replacement, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You could have it for breakfast. You could have it as a meal replacement. You could have it before or after you work out, instead of a protein shake. It's so much nicer than a protein shake. And the thing about all of these commercial protein shakes is that they're loaded with sweeteners and things like aspartame, and that sweeteners are bad news, especially something like aspartame. They actually, more and more studies are showing that they have all the negative effects of sugar consumption and others as well. So no, it's not good at all. So yeah, stick with the raw eggs, add some milk and cream, maybe some honey. You can add a banana if you want as well. You can also make raw egg ice cream. That's the other thing, and that's in my cookbook. Then I have a recipe for absolutely delicious, no churn raw egg ice cream, and you can put on muscle eating ice cream, basically.
That sounds exactly like what I love to do. In terms of putting on muscle, you wouldn't just be sitting there and putting on muscle. Is there kind of a protocol of training that goes with Raw Egg Nationalism? What would be kind of the core message there?
Yes, I've always advocated sort of golden age bodybuilding principles, golden era style workouts. So, my background, I was a martial artist, so I was always very lean. I used to do a lot of calisthenics, kettlebell stuff. I was kind of sold on the notion of functional fitness, which I'm not at all sold on now. I think it's a silly idea, but so I moved over to a strength based routine when I started, or actually just before I started the Raw Egg Nationalism stuff, and then the raw eggs kind of took it into overdrive. But I would say that you should, if you're a beginner and you want to put on mass, then what you really want to do is you want to get strong. So ideally, you should focus on bench press, deadlift and squat, overhead press, and then add in some supplementary exercises for the smaller body parts, maybe some bicep curls, some tricep work, chin ups, stuff like that, bent over rows. But you can actually make a huge amount of progress with a very, very simple kind of meat and potatoes routine. And a lot of the golden era bodybuilders, you have to remember, had very little access to equipment because a lot of it hadn't even been invented. So, the shiny bells and whistles kind of machinery that you see in a Planet Fitness didn't exist in the 1960s, 1950s, not even really until the 1980s. So, you can build an amazing physique with basic compound exercises. That's what you should focus on, and that's what a lot of the golden age bodybuilders did, and that's what I've done.
And this would be necessarily lifting heavy things, putting them down to failure, or just kind of.
Yes, yeah. I mean, whether or not you go to failure or not is a kind of moot point. But what you want to be doing is you want to be building strength over time. So you're going for progressive overload, probably in lower rep ranges. So there's a very famous style of training called 5x5, where you do 5 sets of 5 reps, bench press, squat, deadlift, and then you add 2.5 pounds the next time you do the lift. Do 5 sets of 5, 2.5 pounds, and so on, and you just work up like that. That's the kind of thing that you want to be doing. You do have to. I mean, a lot of people who go into the gym pick up weights and sort of half-heartedly, do 10 repetitions or whatever, put the weights down, and then do that a couple more times, and then kind of leave, and then wonder why they don't make any progress. You do need to be pushing yourself. I mean, the thing is, when you're a beginner, though, especially if you're coming in from being somebody who has very little experience of exercise, somebody who doesn't do very much at all, then the mere stimulus of being there will be enough, and for a while that will carry you. But at a certain point, then you do have to get quite serious about it. And one of the things I would recommend is to keep a journal. So just have a little book and write down everything you did in your exercise, everything you did in your workout as you're doing it, so that you can keep track of your progress over time, because that is the way in the long term that you will make gains, is to ensure that you are adding weight to the bar over time and getting stronger.
And you said that you weren't that keen on functional fitness anymore. I mean, what is wrong with that approach?
Well, I think that people. It's obviously true that some exercises translate into real world capability more than others. But people get it. People have got this idea for some reason, I don't know why, that barbell exercises in particular, because like in the real world, you don't do a bench. I mean, when would you do a bench press movement necessarily, or when would you do a pure squat movement? So with a barbell on your back. So they get this idea perhaps that doing those exercises, all you're doing is you're building muscle for show. And you hear people say, oh, so and so is muscle bound, so and so's muscles are for show, or whatever. And that maybe that is true to an extent. You can be too muscular. You only need to look at the kind of Mr. Olympia competitors who can barely sort of waddle through the aisles of the supermarket when they're off the stage or out of the gym. But the functional fitness meme sort of leads people down these really ridiculous avenues where they think that what you have to be doing is you have to be doing squats on top of a Bosu ball, balanced on top of a bench, on top of a broomstick or something, and it's just ridiculous. You don't with exercises like that, among other things, what you can't do is you can't really progress. It's very, very difficult to progress with movements like that. Whereas with a barbell, then, you really can progress. You can add more weight to the barbell each week or month or whenever and progress. But when you do these sort of silly functional fitness exercises, you can't progress. And in any case, I just think that, you would be far better off focusing on adding weight to your squat, for instance, if you want to be explosive, if you want to be a powerful running back in football or whatever, you'd be far better off just adding weight to your squat than trying to do 100 silly sort of different exercises that apparently capture some aspect of real world movement that squatting with a barbell doesn't. So, yeah, I mean, it's not, which isn't to say that I don't think that there is any value in doing things like body weight exercises or kettlebell exercises, because there obviously is. And especially as we've seen over the last 2 years with the lockdowns and things, then actually, you can end up in a situation where you have no access to equipment whatsoever. And that can happen very, very quickly. And it's much better to do something rather than nothing. okay, you might want to bench press, but actually you might have to build a workout, a chest workout, out of doing press ups, and changing your hand or foot position to alter the leverage to make it harder or easier or whatever. So yeah, I certainly wouldn't discourage people from doing that kind of thing if they have to, because any exercise is better than none, certainly.
So in the end, the conclusion seems that it's just about building strength, and strength will translate into whatever it is you want to do with it afterwards.
Yes, yeah. Building strength won't necessarily make you a better long distance runner. Although it might actually. I think you would be surprised actually that the kind of crossover benefits that a long distance runner might experience, for instance, from building up their squat strength. And certainly, if you're a sprinter, then you can develop explosive strength in the gym, with a barbell. But yes, the thing with the right wing bodybuilder movement is that it's an aesthetic thing too, as well. It's a middle finger to the establishment, which wants you to be fat, sick, depressed, and unmotivated. It's the most visible way that you can show the regime that actually you're not on board with that. You believe that actually the human body is a beautiful, beautiful machine that has been created, to do things, to do amazing things. And yeah, so that's what ultimately we're trying to do. It's not just about it's about building muscles for show. Yes, muscles that look good, but also muscles that can do things too.
Yes, I think that was very well captured by the recent Tucker Carlson documentary, of which you were the star. I think it's called "The End of Men," wasn't it?
Yes.
And yeah, tell me a little bit about that. The process of being in that documentary, of recording it. I know Ben Braddock was also in the documentary. So yeah, it's an interesting milestone, I think, for the movement.
Yeah, it's mad. I still have to pinch myself from time to time to remind myself that this is all real and not some very strange, silly dream. It's hilarious. I find myself laughing as well quite a lot now when I think about it. Think about going on the Tucker Carlson show to talk about it as well. But yeah, it was a surreal thing to be contacted and asked to be a part of it. To think that Tucker obviously pays attention to what we're doing. Tucker obviously has eyes and ears in our world and is taking very serious notice. It's not, despite what the blue checks and the commentators would have you believe, it's not a joke, and I think that Tucker Carlson is very, very seriously behind the message of the documentary. I think he believes it, as we obviously do. But yeah, the process was very, 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 very strange. I when I was told what we were going to be doing, that we'd be shooting bottles of vegetable oil and all that kind of stuff, and yeah, it was just crazy. But I recorded 2.5 hours of interviews for that. I thought it would be like, you hear these stories about people who've recorded 3 hours or a day's worth of scenes for a film or something, and then it works out being at 30 seconds. And so I thought, he'll probably, it'll just be a little clip of me, maybe a sound bite or something. But then it turned out to be 15 minutes of me espousing the whole Raw Egg Nationalist and right wing bodybuilder philosophy, which was incredible, really. But
Yeah.
it's very timely, I think, very timely, and it's not these issues aren't issues that traditionally get mainstream coverage. The extent to which people are being poisoned by these harmful chemicals should be a matter of national and global interest for ordinary people, and yet it's something that most people wouldn't have a clue what a xenestrogen is. If you ask them, they wouldn't know what BPA is or what phthalates do, and they wouldn't be able to tell you a thing about it. So he's done a real service, I think, Tucker. He really has, and also put his neck on the line because, of course, critics have wanted to label it fascistic and all that kind of stuff because it's regimented fitness and cult of the body and all that kind of stuff. But I mean, there's obviously no substance to that. But he could have taken an easier path. He certainly didn't have to get on board with us and get us to talk and give us a platform, but he did, and I'm very glad that he did.
Yeah, it was a really good documentary. I don't think you can get it everywhere. I think it's streaming in the US, but there is. I'll try to find the link where it was uploaded for my European audience.
It's on Rumble and BitChute
on
now.
Rumble. Oh, okay, good. That's great. I'll add the link in the show notes. But yeah, it was a really startling to. I'm sure there are more kind of anons in there that people are familiar with, but are not necessarily declaring that they've been in the documentary. But I think one of the other messages in the documentary was the kind of the testosterone collapse, which is one of the big messages in the background. Is that something that you feel you could diagnose just from lifestyle factors and these, environmental factors, or is there something more to that?
I mean, I think it is just fundamentally, yes, it is. It's lifestyle and diet. I mean, one of the things that you have to realize about being overweight as a man is that being overweight is one of the primary causes of hypergonadism. So hypergonadism is low testosterone. So it's mostly overweight men who are diagnosed with hypergonadism. So being overweight is terrible for your testosterone. But then yes, it's diet, lifestyle, and exposure to these horrible estrogenic chemicals that are everywhere. I do think that is probably about it. I think that's certainly more than enough to be getting on with. If we could address all of those factors, then I can guarantee you that men and women would be so much healthier.
And is there a place for women in the Raw Egg Nationalist movement?
Yeah,
because I know you're the editor of the Man's World magazine. Is there? I don't know. Are there women? I mean, I know the main right wing bodybuilders are male, especially the anonymous ones for sure. At least as far as we know. And I don't. Maybe I'm not familiar, but is there kind of a subgroup of female things that are being discussed there? I should know, but I don't, to be honest.
Of female issues, do you mean?
Issues, yeah, exactly.
Oh, yeah. I mean, yes. I mean, and this is actually something that's covered in the Tucker documentary. He interviews Tiger Lily and talks about the kind of dreadful toll that these chemicals and foods and lifestyle changes are taking on women too. And so, yes, I mean, absolutely. If we cleared up the environment of all of these estrogenic chemicals, if we reduced exposure across the board, and if we got everybody to stop eating vegetable and seed oils and so much sugar, and to do some exercise and go back to eating nutrient-dense animal foods, then yeah, I mean, a lot of problems that women have would disappear too. I mean, these estrogenic chemicals are responsible for all sorts of things. They're responsible, I think, for the rise in conditions like endometriosis, polycystic ovary syndrome, all that kind of stuff. And then you could look at, for instance, the contraceptive pill, estrogenic birth control, all that kind of stuff. I mean, it's wreaking havoc with women's health. And there's actually a very good book if you're interested in the female aspect of this. It's called, I'm looking at it, it's on my shelf right now, The Greatest Experiment Ever Performed on Women by Barbara Seaman. And it's about the discovery of estrogen and then its marketing to women as a kind of as a miracle hormone. Basically, that's how estrogen has been treated, or how it was certainly hailed in the beginning as a miracle hormone. And actually, it's had all sorts of terrible effects. I mean, estrogen is, there are lots of estrogen dependent forms of cancer, especially breast cancer, uterine cancer. And the argument is that actually, the mass prescription of estrogen to women has resulted in deaths. It's not only compromised the quality of life of so many tens of thousands or hundreds or millions of women, but it's also actually led to deaths. It's killed women from cancer. So yes, I think that there is all of this is tied up together. This isn't just a movement for the health of men, although that is, I suppose the emphasis that it gets with the men. It's a movement for human health and flourishing more broadly. And I think it was good that Tucker brought that out, actually, because that could have been a sort of critical flaw, I think, of the documentary, or that would have been something that people would have picked up on. This is just about men. This is just scaremongering about men. But actually, it's for women's benefit too. It's for everybody's benefit. And
Yes.
yeah.
Yes, I do know Tiger Lily, and I do want to recommend. She's had millions of incarnations as well. She keeps getting kicked off of Twitter and all sorts of platforms because she's very outspoken. Yeah, I was just thinking about the bodybuilding aspect. I think that's a bit less represented in women, but yeah, there's definitely a bigger kind of crunchy mom holistic sphere that's adjacent to right wing bodybuilding, of which I am definitely part of. There's I think there's a good segue from this is just kind of the medical community and the hidden cost of medical dysfunction, of bad prescriptions, kind of this iatrogenic cost that people just don't realize, because doctors in many ways deservedly for some directions have this mantle of experts, scientists. They're doing, evidence-based procedures, but at the same time, you were talking about hormones, female hormones. I mean, I was put on progesterone at 13 on the basis of a conversation.
Yeah.
It's the consequences of that have been, dire in many ways for me, and I wasn't the only person. But it's just a fact that having that power. It's I feel like there's very little accountability for what's been done to people with these novel substances, which might be beneficial for some, but are definitely not like a panacea. You can't just be finding something like this and saying, okay, everyone gets to have this.
Well, look, I mean, look at what's happened over the last 2 years. I mean, if anybody needed convincing that there are fundamental flaws with the way that medicine works in the modern world, well, look at what's happened over the last 2 years. Look at the way that people's legitimate fears about a novel form of therapy were totally. Well, we're not only dismissed; those people were gaslit and treated as extremists. Not only by the media and not only by sort of commentators, people on Twitter, but the government and the medical industry. And they've made a lot of money. But they've also caused a huge amount of harm. But yes, iatrogenesis is a very, very interesting subject. I mean, I did a thread actually about iatrogenesis today because I was reading a paper about it. Iatrogenesis. This is the theory that actually medical treatment, the whole sort of medical profession, actually causes harm and may even cause more harm than good on balance. I think iatrogenesis is the 5th leading cause of death in the world. That's one estimate. And I did a whole thread about based on a paper that was just listing some of the statistics that have been gathered about things like reactions to drugs, adverse drug reactions, things like that. It's something like 10% of patients have adverse drug reactions. 700,000 people in the US die a year from adverse drug reactions, from being prescribed the wrong drugs. 70% of all sentinel events, so sentinel events are serious, are events in a healthcare setting that lead to serious harm or death. 70% of those are caused by miscommunication between medical professionals. Miscommunication, something like telling a nurse to give someone an injection in their spine rather than in a vein or something, or that kind of thing. I mean, it's a serious problem, and it's difficult to know, as you say, how to hold these people to account. And the sad thing about what's happened over the last 2 years is that I don't really see a way how we're going to hold these people to account. I mean, you saw that piece about the pandemic amnesty. Oh, we need a pandemic amnesty. I mean, it's easy to say that when most of the fault is on your side, when you are one of the people who has been in the position of wronging others rather than being wronged. I mean, traditionally, didn't we beg for forgiveness when we'd done something wrong? I mean, isn't that the way that you traditionally gain forgiveness, is you beg for it? And it's dependent on the good character of the person being begged, the magnanimity of the person being begged. But actually, we're being told, look, you have to forget everything that happened over the last 2 years. You have to forget the gaslighting. You have to forget that you weren't allowed to see your grandmother when she was dying in the nursing home. You weren't allowed to go and hold your wife's hand when she was in labor. Although I'm sure that some women probably don't want their husbands or boyfriends in the room with them when they're in labor, but that kind of thing. I mean, ordinary people have suffered so much over the last 2 years, and so much is coming out now. So much is coming out. They've had to walk back all of their claims about the efficacy of the vaccines. They've had to walk back, and they've had to admit things that a year ago or 6 months ago or a year and a half ago were denied as conspiracy theories. They've actually had to admit them, and people were banned from Twitter for saying things and banned from social media for saying things that now actually medical authorities and the government are admitting are true.
Well, I got a strike on my YouTube account for a conversation I had, months ago, half a year ago, with Ben Braddock, actually. When we were talking about COVID, things that now are common knowledge and are admitted. I got that strike 2 weeks ago. So it's still, these things are still being enforced at the same level. They're still going after their enemies for wrong thing that, it's like, what's that called? A celebration parallax type situation where, we're still being punished for common truths that only they can say. And also, let's all get along. Yeah, it's ridiculous.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's crazy, and I don't see how. I mean, we need to do something. These people do need to be held accountable. At the very least, we need to find a way to make it so that something like this can't happen again. But the question is how we would do that. I mean, I think obviously there's a political route to that, and we need to elect people who say that that's precisely what they want to do. That they want to make sure that stuff like this can't happen again. That the medical profession can't behave this way. That government can't behave this way. And also that social media companies can't behave this way. I mean, you're always going to get ordinary people behaving badly, but they, people have been enabled by or disabled by social media companies, hand in glove with corporations and the medical establishment. So, I mean, it's a complicated business, but we can't just sweep it under the rug. But that is precisely what they want to do, of course, is to sweep it under the rug. But then it will happen again.
Yeah. It seems to me like we've moved into a very different phase of history where it's very hard to hold people to account because things are moving so fast. Like the narrative is so all encompassing and it's pushing forward at lightning speed. Like, just things like lab leak,
Yeah.
just the implications of that. And the fact that it's plausible, but no one cares anymore. We're on to the next thing. Even Ukraine is old hat. All of these things are it's just one churning big I don't know, just like a I don't know, like a shredder that we're all being pushed into.
Mm,
And even, let the chips fall where they may. I've had family members die because of the circumstance of the last years.
mm.
And, it's, not only do I have no recourse, um, no one cares. Like, I don't even have anyone to talk to about it. It's like, yeah, whatever. What's new in Ukraine? What's the next thing? It's very disconcerting.
Well, one of the things actually that really depressed me last year, or really shocked me, was um, so the Euro 2020 football tournament was postponed for a year because of the coronavirus. So so that's for people who don't know, then that's a football, a soccer competition between the European nations. Basically, it's a tournament, and it should have taken place in 2020, but it was pushed back to 2021, and it was like people just when it actually happened, and England did quite well. We got to the final, although we lost in the final on penalties. Um, it was just like, I mean, it was very definitely a release valve, I would say. I think that all the huge amount of tension that had built up in the country because of the social restrictions were just, it was all let off. And because we did well, and it was like, oh, actually, the last 18 months haven't happened. And people were just pretending like everything was back to normal. And it was just so surreal. I was just like, oh, people are so happy about all of this, and they're so pleased that they've just forgotten what's happened to them for the last year and a half. It really was a kind of bread and circuses, I suppose. But yeah,
Yeah, I
it's
I feel like the level of bread and circuses is so advanced, so high now that I really wonder what the compromise in lifestyle or what the personal tragedy um, would have to occur in each of these people's lives for them to get shaken up a little bit. Like how
yeah,
much immiseration can you stand before you ask questions?
yeah. I mean, it's like, I mean, in Britain at one point in the early stages of the pandemic, in the first year of the pandemic, then it was made illegal. It was actually made illegal to have sex with someone who wasn't your partner or spouse who was living with you. It's like, I mean,
Very trad.
yeah, we very briefly became an Islamic republic, but it was just like, imagine if you told somebody that that was going 10 years ago, that was going to happen in 2020, that the government was going to tell ordinary citizens who they could and couldn't, have a romantic relationship with. It's like, it's crazy, but I don't know what you would have to do. You lock people in their houses and tell them that they can't do anything. I mean, what's worse than that, really? But I mean, the depressing thing actually was seeing. I encountered quite a few young people who were actually quite keen on the idea of another lockdown. So when the second or third lockdown was coming, then I did hear a few people say things like, "Oh yeah, I've got some Netflix series that I want to watch, and I can have 8 weeks off work and watch all the Netflix backlog that I've built up." And it's like, Jesus, you just don't understand, do you? Um, I think I
Yeah.
think I think it has demonstrated that a lot of people, maybe the majority of people, even certainly something close to half, are basically unreachable. I think, which isn't a
Yeah.
nice thing to. I mean, a nice thing to realize, particularly, but I suppose it clarifies the mind, and maybe it suggests then other solutions to our problems than simply relying on getting the majority of the population behind you.
Yeah, I mean, they don't call it the populist delusion for nothing. It's yeah, I think this is a conclusion that a lot of people in kind of our wider circle are reaching. Yeah, it's not about them. And sadly, because ideally you'd want to have everyone's vote, but yeah, unfortunately that's not how things work. And I feel like if the last 2 or 3 or 5 years haven't proven that to most people, then you haven't been paying attention. Like it's not nothing's been decided in an election except for, culture war screeching, but nothing really of substance. The same people run the same stuff, the NGOs, the headless, faceless bureaucrats. It's all churning away in the background, getting more and more complex and inscrutable with every iteration.
Yeah, totally. No, I totally agree. Yeah, I totally agree. It's, I mean, it's potentially a black pill, but also, I think, as I say, it's an opportunity to clarify our thinking about what actually needs to be done, what is likely to be effective, and what isn't. And
Exactly. And a lot of the things that can be done start, at the basis of oneself and the people around you and just making things work. I mean, I know you're a proponent of regenerative agriculture, of having maybe a few chickens of your own. There are things that you can do in your own life that might not lead to the, I don't know, the death of Klaus Schwab or whatever, big regime enemies one might have, but it does lead to a lot of important changes in just your life, which is essentially what matters most.
I think so. I think it's important to be humble. I think that's one of the benefits actually of what Jordan Peterson has done, and for all his faults, I think that he's drawn people's attention to the benefits of taking a humble stance towards the things that are wrong in your life. You know, start small. Uh, take care of the small things, and the big things will look after themselves, as the biblical proverb has it. So, yeah, I think there's a lot to be. There is something that you can do, even if you can't alter the the larger scale political system in the way that you might like to, with a click of your fingers or a tick in a ballot box. Uh, there are things that you can do that will add up, if lots of people do them as well, into a fundamental change. And that's one of the things that I talk about in the Eggs Benedict option, is the way that people can return to local agriculture. So I use local forms of agriculture. So I use the example of this thing that's called Russian household gardening, which is quite an amazing system. Really, it's an outgrowth of the peasant model of agriculture that sort of has been present in agriculture in Russia since the since the first millennium AD. Since the beginning of the Russian kingdoms, the Russian principalities. It's small scale, local food production. You might have a garden, or you might have a plot of land in the countryside. So Russia is now predominantly an urban nation. 2/3 of people in Russia live in the cities, and yet millions and millions of Russians head out of the cities to little plots of land in the surrounding countryside to grow vegetables, fruit and vegetables organically, and they keep animals, they keep chickens and maybe pigs and things like that. And Russians actually produce, on 3% of all of the total land under tillage in Russia, or under cultivation in Russia, they produce over 50% of the food that the country produces by value. So ordinary people do that. Ordinary people produce something like, I think it's 92% of all potatoes that are eaten in Russia. Significant quantities, 87%, I think, of fruit and berries that people eat. Significant quantities of milk and eggs. And this is a modern nation. This is a modern nation of 150 million people. There's no reason why we have to rely totally on industrial agriculture to provide our needs. A system like that could work in the US, has worked in the past. There have been back to the land drives. There was a back to the land drive in World War II, victory gardens. People started, millions and tens of millions of people started cultivating their own food to help in the war effort. It would obviously require political will. I think it would have to be a political movement as well. And that's something that I talk about in the book, about the links between populism and small scale farming and all that kind of stuff. We shouldn't forget that Thomas Jefferson's ideal for the US was as a nation of small farmers. Uh, and that doesn't necessarily have to mean people homesteading. That could just mean that actually people start to produce a decent share of their own food themselves and break free of the corporate stranglehold. I mean, that would do everyone. That would do the country. That would do the US, the world of good, to break the corporate stranglehold on agriculture, because that's just it's part and parcel with the corporate stranglehold on American life. Full stop.
Yeah, it's interesting because the partly this is what's happening in Romania as well. Just a interesting side note there, because I used to go to wine school or enology. I kind of studied this viticulture essentially,
Yeah.
and a big problem that we have here with farmers is that they're getting in the farm shops in the villages even they're getting access to these insanely powerful pesticides,
Mm,
herbicides, and fertilizers, and they tend to overuse them. And
yeah, of
this
course.
even goes towards like I don't know, like for in wine production, there are sulfites that you add to
Yeah.
wine, and they protect the wine from oxidation. They protect it from going bad. You don't need like a perfectly sealed stainless steel vat to produce your wine. You can produce in weirder conditions, and that's sadly makes some of the produce that comes out of the farmers market essentially even more laden with these things because people don't know how to apply them. They really like the new technology.
Mm,
The weed killer works amazingly. The fertilizer makes everything pop. Roundup is great, and they can get all that now. And that's kind of the sad thing because you think, oh, I'm just going to go to farmers market. I'm going to get like my organic produce, but it's everywhere, and it's sad. And I would have been a bigger proponent of farmers markets here if I didn't do the viticulture course and all this type of stuff and saw exactly how just this one crop grapes is treated.
mm.
And yeah, it's a big problem. Like there's layers and layers upon this, but I don't know, it's a sad fact.
Yeah, it is true that a lot of farmers actually, you think farmers are very, very sentimental about the land and about animals and stuff, and actually a lot of them really aren't. Um,
Farming is tough. It's
yeah,
really tough. You're dependent on the weather. Whenever there's some substance or magic potion that gives you an edge, especially if it's cheap and it protects your crop from X or Y,
mm,
possibility of disaster, which many of these things do, you're definitely going to go to the shop and get some magic dust and spray
yeah.
it on your crops or whatever.
Well, in the Soviet Union, famously, then they for a while they came up with this idea of basically firing radioactive material into the soil to make it more productive. And they created these sort of special tractors that would go around firing, I think it was cesium or something like that, some horrible radioactive substance to make their crops grow. And of course, it had all these terrible, terrible side effects, including poisoning the land for many, many, hundreds or maybe even thousands of years for future generations. But yes, I mean, it's interesting actually. Russia, for all its faults, Russia is committed now to being the world's largest producer of organic food. That was actually a commitment that has been made by the Russian government and is being encouraged in stark contrast to the trajectory of the EU, which is, for a long time, the EU actually had some quite good environmental regulations, but they're starting to fall by the wayside. There was a landmark case in the European Court to do with Italy, where I can't remember the exact details, but some farmers or some groups didn't want farmers to use a particular kind of genetically modified crop, and then the EU court said that, well, since this crop has been declared legal in the whole of the EU, you can't make an exception in Italy. And so, yes, I mean, the situation in the EU is actually starting to move closer to America than it is Russia, which is a shame because actually the EU, and Britain, even Britain outside the EU, could actually be a bastion for the best kind of farming rather than the worst. But it actually looks at the moment like Russia is going to be, if you want to look to any one particular nation for the the model for farming in the future, for real, good farming, then yeah, it's probably Russia.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, for sure for Romania, the EU has been a mixed blessing. I mean, I personally have big problems with it. It's been useful in some ways. I've talked about this on the podcast as well. It's broken quite a like a game theory problem that we had with corruption, because they kind of imposed external order and oversight, and it really did help with reducing corruption, which really is a big problem. Like you couldn't do business with Romania 20, 30 years ago. It was almost impossible. Now it is possible. It's okay. People expect to not have to pay bribes when they go to a place. There's the burden of expectations has moved on to the don't pay bribes end, which is an amazing improvement. Instead of the for sure I'm going to have to dish out some bribe, and then I'll be there's a whole awkward thing of where you put it, what it's going to be, who you're going to give it to. Now it's different. I'm not saying there are no bribes, but it's not like you go to the dentist, you have to bribe him. You go to the post office, you have to bribe them. So it's really eased things. On the other hand, we have an eternal stranglehold of regulations, one crazier than the other, and apparently also, the regulations that you highlighted. So that's a great one to add to the naughty list. I know we're coming up on time, and I want to ask you the last question, the question of the show, and everyone gets this question. It's the subversive thinker question. Do you have anyone that you found influential? I mean, you mentioned Weston Price, but anyone who was an important influence for you and you think is underrated and people should read more of, if you could point us in that direction.
Let me think. Who do I like? Well, okay. Here's somebody who's been a big influence on my recent work is an anthropologist called James C. Scott. And
Seeing Like a State.
Seeing Like a State. But yes, that's a great book. He wrote books. His early books were about sort of silent forms of resistance, the way that peasants can resist exactions by their lords by doing things like dragging their feet and sabotage and all that kind of stuff. But he wrote a book a few years ago called Against the Grain. And that was a very, very big influence on the way that I came to frame the Eggs Benedict option. So Against the Grain is an historical account of the agricultural revolution. And contrary to the happy, clappy sort of story of the agricultural revolution, which is that the transition to farming was a wonderful boon for mankind, and it made life so much easier and regular, and you could guarantee food production, and it led to civilization and all this kind of stuff. Parts of which are true, of course. Scott tells a very different story based on up-to-date archaeology and sorts of other epidemiology, all sorts of other stuff about the real burden of the transition to agriculture, and the fact that actually it benefited a very, very narrow elite. But the majority of people who were subjected to it, and they were forced to become farmers for the most part, really, really lost out. And that, for me, I think, was allowed me to make a very, very provocative comparison with what might happen with the Great Reset if we're all forced into eating plant-based diets, which is that is the Great Reset model for the future of food, of course. And I think that is actually the basis or the real underpinning of the Great Reset. So, the Neolithic revolution was a social transformation predicated on a transformation in the way food was produced and consumed. And the Great Reset is exactly the same, more or less, but with very similar aspects, and also some new sort of wild cards thrown in there. So yes, I would recommend reading James Scott, but especially Against the Grain. It's a provocative, it's readable. He's one of these interesting academics who is a wide-ranging non-specialist, but he's so well read, and he's articulate and provocative, and it's not, nothing about it is dry. It's not a dry book at all. It's an interesting book, and he talks about why life was better as a barbarian. He says there was this thing called the golden age of barbarians for sort of a couple of thousand years, maybe up until about the sort of 1600s, where actually, if you were a barbarian, you were likely to be happier, healthier, and freer than somebody a peasant living under in a grain state. So that's a fantastic book. That's one that I would heartily recommend.
Yeah, that sounds like an excellent recommendation. Thank you so much. This has been lovely. I'm so glad we got to do this. And I want to point people again towards your books. I mean, the latest one is the Eggs Benedict option, but you have cookbooks, you have Man's World magazine, you have a extended opus which includes documentaries aired internationally, and many many more bits of media, other podcasts as well. I'll link the documentary in the show notes and your latest book as well. Is there any other thing that people should be paying attention to in the raw egg sphere?
I've got an op-ed coming out in the Epoch Times on Friday, which is pretty big news, I think. And you're probably going to see me writing for some more mainstream conservative outlets. I write for American Mind already. I've written 4 pieces for them, and I'll continue to write for them, hopefully, but also for some other people. So stay tuned. There's big news coming up. Keep your eyes and ears on my Twitter, and you'll find out what those things are.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
It was a pleasure. Thank you for having me.